Andrew Klavan is a Jew, and Andrew was lost. Not because he was a Jew, but because he was having a crisis of faith. Or, to be more precise, Andrew Klavan didn't know if he believed in God. He was 13 years old, and he had recently had his bar mitzvah, which is the Jewish rite of passage for boys. And this was in the 1960s, so even for then, he says he received a very large amount of gifts, totaling in the thousands of dollars that he kept in his bedroom on a shelf in a box. And that was just part of the problem. So it was, as he describes his own experience, that Andrew decided one night as a young boy that he would do something to try to relieve his guilt. His mother was an atheist. His father was a radio comedian who, when it came to God, Andrew writes this, he says, my father hedged his bets a little. It was not in his nature to defy a gigantic invisible Jew who could give you cancer just thinking about it. So Andrew's parents put him through Jewish practices, but more for tradition than from belief. Sure, they observed the Jewish holidays, but he just fit in. So this boy who was becoming a man, decided it was time to be honest with himself. So one night, after everyone's asleep, Andrew gathers up his bar mitzvah gifts. He creeps downstairs, slithers outside to the garbage cans, and he proceeds to bury his gifts worth thousands of dollars in the week's trash so it can be picked up and taken away tomorrow by the trash haulers. Why? Well, here's his explanation. With this gesture, I hope to leave behind not only Judaism, but religious life entirely. No more hypocrisy and empty show. For the next 35 years, I remained a philosophical agnostic and a practical atheist. Andrew moved into the category of what society during Jesus' day would have called sinners. The so-called sinners that Jesus meets with here are people who were not observant Jews, people who did not obey the laws of God, who denied even that there was a God of the Jews. Andrew, then, in Jesus' day, would have been one of these people. Now, the tax collectors and the sinners were all gathering around to hear. You see, it's all the Andrews of the village where Jesus was who were gathering together, we might imagine, at some pub where they were going to have a good night together. A little something to drink, a little something to eat, and there they were, all gathering around. Now the question is, where's Jesus going to be, right? Because Andrew and all of the Andrews of that village would have been there with Jesus. So does that surprise you? Does that shock you that Jesus would be there with Andrew, all the Andrews, the ones who always seem to be hanging out with the people that good society says are outcasts? That's where Jesus was? Let me ask you this. If this story was today, if Jesus was here today, who would it be that he would be meeting with that the religious authorities would be upset? Who is it that it would shock you that Jesus was meeting with? Them? And should Jesus be there at all? Who would you be surprised to hear that Jesus had dinner with last night? You know, there must have been something about Jesus, though, right? That made the Andrews of his day want to gather around to hear him. There had to be something about his personality, something about his words that made people who were outcasts want to be with him, this rabbi, this teacher of the law, and yet the tax collectors and the sinners want to be with him. You know, our picture of Jesus, of course, is distorted because of Hollywood's early efforts to portray Jesus as this meek man who spoke so quietly you could hardly hear him and spoke in, short clipped sentences that I don't know who would have gathered around to hear him. But these people gathered around him because Jesus must have been a really good storyteller. Jesus must have been a lot of fun to be around. And so when the tax collectors and sinners are wrapping up their day in the office, they say, "Hey, we're all meeting over at Abe's tonight. Jesus is going to be there." And so they gather. They gather around. But then, of course, there are the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law are the religious leaders of the day. They're the ones who are looking for Jesus to make some mistake that they can use against him to bring him to his death, because he's upsetting the apple cart in a big way. You see, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law and Jesus agreed on one thing. They agreed that these Andrews of the world were lost. The question is, what are you going to do about it? For the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, their solution was, all of heaven will rejoice when there's one sinner like that obliterated from the earth. That was the way they thought about it then. Jesus came with this other message. There will be joy in heaven when one of these sinners is found. Which camp would you rather be in? Which camp are you in as you think about people that you classify as today's tax collectors and sinners? Do you want them obliterated, or do you want to go find them? So the tax collectors and sinners are in there with Jesus, and the Pharisees and the teachers are muttering. Who's right? Who's wrong? Well, think about it this way. There's two circles. One is the sinners. One is the religious leaders. Which camp do you want Jesus to be in? Which camp are you in? Let's start with that. Put yourself in one of those two circles. And now ask yourself, where should Jesus be? What got everybody so upset is he shows up there. How can that be right? And so it is that Jesus gets this reputation of being a glutton and a wine drinker, hanging out with all the people that society has rejected. So let me tell you what John Calvin says about this. John Calvin is a writer who a lot of people in our faith tradition follow because he's a brilliant man. And we think of John Calvin as sort of, this strict man who's this disciplinarian, this guy who has a very conservative view of the Bible. So listen to what John Calvin had to say about this very passage. It is in the highest degree unreasonable that we should disdainfully reject those whom the Son of God has so highly esteemed, not for the value of their virtues, but for the sake of Christ. You see what he's saying? It would be horrible, disdainful for us to reject the very people that Jesus came to save. We should want to be with them, not for their virtues. We're not saying everything you're doing is right, that sin is a good thing, sin is a bad thing. But that's the whole point of Jesus going to meet them, right? Not for their virtues, but for the sake of Christ. And he continues, the whole human race belongs to God. Therefore, we ought to gather together those who have gone astray. That's the work of the church. That's how God works. He finds a way to reach Andrew. You see, Andrew now, 35 years later, he's a middle-aged man, and one night he's lying in bed and he's reading some novel. And as he tells his story, he's reading about some character that he identifies with and he admires, and this character prays before he goes to sleep at night. So Andrew puts the book down as he's lying in bed, and he says, well, if he can pray, I suppose I could too. And so he prays. 3 words. Thank you, God. He describes that prayer as an experiment with faith. He was experimenting, just trying it out, this prayer business, to God who he wasn't even sure was there. In fact, who he denied was there. But God's response, he says, was an act of extravagant grace. And that grace led Andrew to believe that everything had changed. What he was experiencing as he prayed, he described as my joy of joy, which over time became, he says, his constant companion. Jesus explains what's going on with Andrew like this. He says, God is like a shepherd who has 99 sheep over here, but he's got one who's out there in the wilderness. So what does God do? Does he say, 99's good enough? No. He goes out and he searches in the wilderness for the one. Or, Jesus says, God is like this woman. And isn't that interesting? That God is described both as a male and a female. This characteristic that God has, that all of those motherly instincts, all of those instincts that women uniquely have, are attributed to God as well, because he says it's like this woman who has 9 coins that are hers, but there's one that's missing. So this woman gets out the broom and she sweeps, and she gets out the light and she looks and she looks and she moves all the furniture. She moves the refrigerator. She gets in the darkest corner and she finds the missing coin. That's what God is like. That's why Jesus eats with sinners. Because that's what brings joy. Rejoice with me, I found my lost sheep. Rejoice with me, I found my lost coin. That's what these stories are about, is that it is in the finding, that brings joy. It is the joy of finding. It is finding joy. The joy of finding Andrew. So Andrew is out driving in the countryside one day after he comes to know the joy of the presence of God through prayer. He's full of joy and he prays again to God, how can I thank you for what you've done for me? What could I ever do in return? And then he writes, as clearly as if he had spoken aloud, God answered, now you should be baptized. Andrew writes, I was stunned. Nothing could have been further from my mind. I was a man of coasts and cities, at home among the snarks and cynics of postmodern times. I was a realist who believed in science and reason, a worldling who loved sex, violent movies, politics, and a good single malt scotch. Well, it didn't happen right away. It took a church to bring Andrew to the font. And that's the challenge of the church today. The challenge of the church today is to make the 2 circles into one. Jesus is the foundation. The religious leaders are the 99. They're the 9 coins, the 99 sheep who need to be with Jesus, seeking with Jesus the sinners. And then they will know, and then we will know the joy of finding the lost. That is the church. The church is not about making more and more rules that build higher and higher walls so that those who are out there stay out there and the 99 stay in. The work of the church is to go outside of the walls and to seek the lost, to pull them from the thorn bushes, to move the refrigerators, to do whatever it takes, because we know when that happens, there is joy in heaven. Andrew says, the moment I rose from my knees, this is in his Christianity Today testimony that he writes, the moment I rose from my knees by the baptismal font, I knew I had stepped through some invisible barrier between myself and I was on a remarkable new journey. That's why Jesus gathers with sinners. Just like he is today in this place, gathered with sinners, me, you. That's why he invites the religious leaders, me, you, to share in his work and his joy, his finding joy. The joy of heaven comes not from keeping people out. The angels don't rejoice when bigger walls are built, when we exclude people, when we exclude those with whom we disagree. The angels rejoice when the church makes the company of heaven more complete by finding one more sheep. So, we come today to the font as well. And we come because Jesus has found one more sleeping sheep. You see, that's the amazing thing, isn't it? That Jesus has found this sheep. Jesus searched for her through grandpa and grandma and great-grandpas and great-grandmas and mom and dad and brother and through Hope Church. And Jesus says, today, let's have a party. Because along with Dad and Grandpa, who are standing there with the angels in heaven with their hands raised high, even though maybe they never raised their hands on earth, they're raising their hands now, and they're filled with joy. Because today, the lost has been found. Who's next?